And if you go back to Saussure, the idea of the sign, it's as if there's no speaker of that. It just sort of floats disembodied wise into this space of linguistics, okay? And well, who's actually saying it? How does it impact their, let's say, present experience? Again, what does it mean for that speaker to have a body? What kind of body is it? Is it a race body? Is it a gender body? Is it? There are many other factors that make bodies. Nowhere present in someone like Saussure. So it just shows how much more work, how much more theorizing was needed once that sort of burst. And you could pick any linguist, I think, really, and find some of those same problems. And even when Jakobson adds a little bit more context, he has yet to really actually put bodies into that space. That would be one thing to think of in the history of thinking about language. Well, also this kind of course is the history of thinking about questions around form, literary form. And again, if you're a formalist, if you're a new critic and you're coming to the text, it's as if you left your body at the door, right? Because you all would be handed out, let's say, Robert Frost's latest poem, and you're reading Robert Frost together, and you don't really have, you're swinging those birches or whatever, but you don't. Who are you, the reader? Do you have a body? Are you? It's sort of like the text has appeared, sort of decontextualized or floating in front of you, and you are there to sort of tease out the metaphors and maybe this boy who's enjoying himself in sort of a kind of uninhibited way or something like that. I don't know. So it's not like to say there's no bodies in these poems. They are there, but what you were reading for were things like metaphor or irony or tension or tone, or even if you're Paul Duman, you were reading for the sort of the rubbing of the semiotic and the rhetorical, why couldn't you have done any form of close reading of things like embodiment or we might say character, or like the history of being a person, something like that. All of that you can close read. We've argued that the bread and butter of literary theory is close reading. I definitely stand behind that. I think that's deep down, if we had to make the case for what sort of methodologies we have in common, it would be that. But even by saying that, it doesn't exactly tell us much, and a lot of people stop short at a certain point. Where do they stop close reading? But let's just admit that one of the problems, I don't know if it'll be a conversation for today, but as we go through, I have a totally unresolved question or kind of, crisis maybe about literary theory, which is just that how are we supposed to assimilate, this is a dozen methodologies over 12 weeks. Like each one of these takes a lifetime. So where do you stop close reading is a real challenge. Some people will say, look, I just don't do ego criticism, or I just don't do queer theory, or I just don't do Marx. Okay, so I stopped close reading at that point. That's totally fine with me. I think you have to stop somewhere. But in reality, we should be close reading everything, because that's sort of the almost utopia of the English department, is that we can close read anything, and it'll mean something. It'll pay off. It'll matter to us. Well, anyways, new criticism stopped close reading at the body, and that's pretty clear to me. Okay, they stopped reading it to some extent at the level of history, embodiment. What does it mean to be a person with history, with race or nation or whatever you want, or gender? They couldn't close read that. But it turns out you want to talk irony, talk about the body, okay? As we're going to see with Judith Butler. You want to talk about something like irony troubles the stability of language. That would be straight out of Dumas. Well, guess what? It does the same thing to bodies, and sort of the troubles of embodiment maybe are something very much about queer theory, but it's also just as much, I would say, about these tropes that were the core of literary theory. So keep that in mind as we generate interesting discussion around queer theory now. Okay, so that's one preamble. Second preamble, what is queer theory? As we're going to see some examples, I think rather than just having a simple definition from the get-go, the examples will provide us different models of that. But just like with feminism, as we talked about, we opened that discussion with understanding feminism as a literary methodology, and not just, let's say, a political or embodied sort of sense of personhood. So if feminism were just about equal rights for women, that would be important enough. But it is also a literary methodology, as we well saw. Okay, and it tells us about the origin of literature, or the function of literature, or the development, whatever you want. So the rise of the novel is the rise of different kinds of narrating of desire, the sort of relationship with, let's say, desire and language, or desire and plot, or desire and whatever you want, but style. Many more topics around feminism, but I won't reiterate that. I'll just say that we're going to do the same thing in art, to some degree, maybe not so much about literature per se today, but we want to do the same thing with queer theory. So we're interested in queer theory as a literary theory, as well as its own just sort of domain, queer theory. And just like with feminism, I would say that there was, I would say, three things that we were doing with feminism. Feminism and literature. Feminism as a question of content. So what are there feminist characters? Are there female characters in the novel? Okay, are there issues around gender, let's say politics and womanhood and so on? That would be at the level of content. But we're also interested in feminism at the level of form, the construction of the novel, the construction of plot, the construction of a marriage plot, or point of view, or anecdotal language, like Virginia Woolf, or like personal language versus scientific language, or as Virginia Woolf said, you write from a sort of double-gendered perspective or something like that. These are all questions of form. Finally, basically, this third category, which is sort of an extension of what I just said, but we want to think of the history and theory of novels and poems themselves. So just to slightly correct myself. So content and form, but form can mean just like this poem. What is the form? Is it like a pastoral or an elegy or something like that? But also form in the longer sense of how are poems and novels made? What are their sort of functions, if you will? And feminism taught us a lot about that. Queer theory does a lot about that too. So one of the reasons I say that is that queer theory is not about just finding the queer character in the text. Okay, to me that's very. It's obviously limited. I also think that's a kind of dead end of literary analysis. If we're just finding queer moments or queer characters or queer scenes, pointing them out. This is exactly kind of what we'll get into. Eve Sedgwick's Episteme du Closet is trying to get away from. For her, that is not queer theory. That is just almost like labeling or something like that. But on the other hand, it's okay to talk about queerness at the level of content sometimes too. But probably more interesting is the relationship of content and form. And just to finally sum up this preamble, so when we would do that, we would be thinking of queerness as not just a character, but how it forms character. So not just a subject, but how it is embedded in, let's say, the process of subjectivity, or the coming to be of a subject, becoming a subject. How it's in desire, how it's in naming, how it's in what we might call sort of becoming different or difference or otherness, how it is involved in experimentation, how it is involved in non-normative language, which is a feature of literature. Literature has a history of changing what the expectations of language is from the get-go, from Shakespeare on. So changes of language, I said non-normative, but it could have just said sort of becoming different through language. Style, relationships, futurity, nature. Is queerness natural, anti-natural, something else? Politics, place, having a place, feeling place, and so on. All of this is in the range of queer theory. It's in the range of feminism. To be honest, it's in the range of every single thing we've been looking at. Psychoanalysis, you name it, deconstruction. All have been talking about similar terrain. So, but I just reemphasize this specifically for queer theory since that's today's topic. And I'll just add that these are all devices. Okay, so when I talk about becoming a subject or experimenting with language or style or futurity, these are all devices, just like a metaphor is a device, or irony is a device, or line ending is a device, or plot or perspective. Like those are traditional devices Those are formalist tools. Those are our bread and butter, yes. You can queer those, or you can psychoanalyze those, whatever you want, whatever your method is. Or also, understand that something like style, difference, embodiment, these are also tropes too, or devices, or figurations, or so on. They're caught up in all that stuff. Okay, so that was my big preamble. All right, finally, just one or two notes going on here. But so queerness is going to be a literary theory. It's also going to be a way of life. It's also going to describe a form of embodiment. So it's covering everything. It's a variety of different things, even in the sense of what queerness is. Finally, I'll just remind us that queerness can be a noun as well as a verb. And as a verb, to queer something, it can. Well, I guess maybe before I even say it, we'll see what it shows us in the text. So that's my large preamble. I kind of have one more thing. I wonder if I should say this now or after we do Foucault, but
now.
Now, okay, Jen. All right. Do you have any tech or anything like that?
Yeah, I have multifarious tech. I have like
Okay,
USB. I have laptop.
Okay. Well, let's just make sure this is on. Because
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, as this is getting fired up, and Jen will take over in just a second. My last preamble, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit here, but just getting a few things up to speed. Which, I don't know if you have a USB or...
Yeah.
Get to that.
Okay.
Which is the famous sex-gender distinction.
Okay. I want to write notes on what you're saying, though. This
Okay.
is why I took this class. Can I just write notes?
Yeah. Okay, the sex-gender system or distinction is the following, and I think I'll just do this vertically. Okay, so if we're talking about sex, historically or traditionally, one might refer that to anatomy, or physiology. Or maybe in a bigger scope, we might say nature. I'm putting slashes here. They're not all equivalent. But already I'm going to put a question mark. Okay? But if we're going back a little bit to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the sex-gender distinction was primarily predicated on this argument that sex is the natural, physiological, could be DNA, chromosomal aspect of a body. And gender would be, I'd say, culture. It could be identification, or a series of similar terms. We're going to see that for Judith Butler, the word performance or performativity. Performative is very key. I want to. Okay, so gender would be another word for this might be social. The social display of one's sexuality. But there was a difference between the two. Okay, so this might be nature, this might be cultural or social or something like that. I'm going to put a question mark here too because I think this is way too binary from the get-go. Okay. There's a third term that we're going to see very important for our discussion today. Third term is sexuality. And this would be acts, desires, non-acts, by the way. You don't actually have to act on anything to be sexual or have a sexual experience. Desires, pleasures, whatever. I want to also say events. Events without necessarily ascribing them either to a gender or a sex category or experience or sort of situation or something like that. Encounters, another word might be for that, whatever. So now we have three possible categories. The reason, though, I'm going to go back to these question marks is that if we rely on the sex-gender distinction, there's already, this is already easily problematized. For example, at the level of physiology. So a trans person can change their physiological characteristics already. So why would we put trans here? Where would we put trans in any of this map? It would cover all three situations, but it wouldn't mean leaving physiology here and not including it in the social, okay? But also, especially when you add a word like nature, well, we've all been taught that there's no such thing as nature anymore, right? Everything is sort of cultural or nature cultural or something like that. And I agree with that, and we can deconstruct, when we've got binaries, nature and culture, and we should. So where do we put nature anymore? That's why it has a question mark. I should have added maybe biology, right? Biology. Right? And the point in putting that all under question is like, well, what cultural formation is it that tells you biology or physiology is fixed? Biology or physiology is primary, or biology or physiology is like, what are you really? So someone says, are you a boy or a girl? Well, what is your, do you have XX or XY chromosomes? That's what you really are. Well, what is the culture that tells you that that biological difference is the one that is the primary one, is the one that matters, okay? So all of a sudden we've just recognized that culture and nature, or whatever, social and physiological are not distinct by any means. So if to any degree that this is becoming someone's anchor point in whatever they're arguing, but by the way, it doesn't, say a right-wing conservative might say this is where true gender lies, but also, as you'll see Sedgwick say, don't concede that. That's not like a left wing, if you will, or a queer person or trans person might also say this is where my sexuality lies. There's a lot of conversation to be had, to say the least. Same thing here, though. I don't want to just say it's all performative, folks. Like that's all you need to know. No, nature doesn't just disappear because we put it into culture now. The biological doesn't just disappear as a question. It still remains as a question here. Finally, even it remains here. One last thing, it doesn't really fit this, but I'll just put it up there as a question. Is this Freud? Is he theorizing sex? No, I mean he's definitely theorizing pleasure. He's theorizing all the above. So where does he fit? Would we put Lacan here, or Judith Butler plus Lacan? Something like that. Is this the contemporary world of queer theory, queer and trans theory? It doesn't exactly work like this. This is not the correct map, but it's interesting to sort of start to put these into dialogue. All of these cover all of these. The truth to be told, but and by the way, we might put something like Freud. I don't even know if we call him a structuralist, but I don't know, psychoanalysis structuralist. Let's just call it psychoanalysis. Short. And then Lacan is both a structuralist and a post-structuralist. And Butler is definitely a post-structuralist. And this would be contemporary. I don't know. Again, this is not a correct map. This part, I'm just making that. Okay? Don't go with that. But it starts to at least indicate that there has kind of been a temporal shift, a methodological shift, as we've seen so far, and we're here. To what degree does this tell us if there's... This is not a temporal shift, but it's interesting to sort of try and understand why there might have been this and how it helps us understand that. That's my point. Okay, that was the preamble. Done. Took a little bit there. Now we're going back to our video.
Okay, so should I just sit here and I can control from here?
Yeah, but did you plug in yet?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, you can
I'm trying to figure it out. I'm notoriously bad with tech. My core class, literally every week they help me, so we'll find out.
This is, USB is ancient tech these days, but it should be.
Oh wait, it worked. Okay, well that was way easier than my other class. Okay. And then how do you use the keyboard? Or is it, it's a touchpad, so
yeah.
it's,
and then,
okay.
You might use one of those.
You can also use
And
the
I'm just
arrows.
gonna do the PDF. But it's just like, is it like a laptop? You just, well,
These have got your left and right clicker buttons at the bottom there. So if you,
okay, yeah. Yes, okay, we're doing it.
okay.
A classic image of, who is this? It's, I forget right now.
Is it Dolly?
Yeah, you got it, yeah. I love him. Okay, so I think you can just put it in like full screen mode because I literally just did this. Yeah, okay, awesome. Okay, the history of sexuality, but it just did that. Oh, it's just playing now. That's not what we want. That's wild. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. Because it's a PDF. How could it do that?
I'm not so good with PDF.
It literally is just playing itself.
Can you try the arrows?
Yeah, I mean, but it's like,
That
it's
works?
time. It's somehow like just
Oh.
going. Well, I don't know. Maybe a read mode? Let's try this. This looks better. Okay. And then the arrows are not going to work. Bro, I'm literally cursed. Okay, then I think I can do, yeah, okay, we got it. Okay, so the history of sexuality, Michel Foucault, we do chapters 1 and 2. Foucault argues that sexuality is a charged concept that is shaped and controlled by institutions over time. So, and he looks at the Middle Ages a little bit, the Victorian period, the 1900s, also the 1800s, or the 1700s. Our reading is part of Foucault's ambitious 4-volume work. I have all 4 volumes. We'll see if I get through them. He looks at like the early Christians, the Greeks, into modernity. So he's critical of psychoanalysis, and we'll see that in a hot second, actually. In a sense, he's the father of gender and sexuality study as a department at the university, and he was writing this in the 70s. Okay. So here's a quote from the famous pervert. So he was talked about in The Other Victorians, and he says, "A Secret Life," and his own writing is a 11-volume work called The Secret Life. So he says, "A secret life must not leave out anything. There is nothing to be ashamed of. One can never know too much concerning human nature." So I'm thinking that Foucault's major argument, in a sense, is that since the 18th century, sex has not ceased to provoke a kind of generalized discursive erethism, which is like an abnormal irritability or responsiveness to stimulation. It's just, like, again, it's a charged topic. But it wasn't in the Middle Ages, which he also goes over. So this argument refutes Freud's ideal. Okay, so first we're talking about the repressive hypothesis, and then we get some perversion of sexuality later. So in the repressive hypothesis, Foucault is basically refuting Freud's ideal of sexual repression. And he's saying the last 300 years, that's not really what was going on with sexuality. This isn't right. It's more complicated than that. And sometimes we still accept Freud's ideas of it. Foucault also I love that he does this. So he also reframes silence to be discourse. So basically he's saying that, like, so Freud is into universalizing and having like one meaning, right? Sexual repression. But Foucault says not only is there multiple discourses, but even silence is another discourse. So even when nothing is happening, he's saying, wow, we're multiplying everything here. So I love that. So really he can never be wrong, right? He's just multiplying discourse. So he says silence itself, the thing one declines to say or is forbidden to name, is less the absolute limit of discourse. It's not the other side from which it is separated by a strict boundary, but what it is actually is an element that functions alongside the thing said. So you have to see like what is not said and why it is not said, and who can authorize what is said or not. So in a sense, it is discourse. Like it's not a vacuum. It's not empty. It has the silence or the lack of ability to speak contains meaning in a sense. So he starts with, this is the essential thing. The Western man has been drawn for 3 centuries to the task of telling everything concerning his sex. And if you read the article, there's literally like so many phrases of like, we can't stop talking about sex, like the mill of sex, like discourses of sex just keep being like propagated. So it's lovely all the language he uses for it. So we've been telling everything concerning sex for the last 300 years, from the 1700s, the classical period. So he talks a tiny bit about, in the medieval period, there's like just more direct reference to like sexual action. But then after that, but the Christian pastoral, so that's the idea of like the ministry, like how the church was being run, they get really into confessional, and so you need to tell everything to the priest basically to abdicate you of sin. So then you proliferate a lot of language and discourse about sexuality, and like even if you're not talking about it as explicitly, like you're just kind of obsessed with it in the absence of like trying to get it out of your system. You just keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. So you name the aspects, correlations, effects, like you just can't stop talking about it. You look through your memories, your soul, your understanding, your will. And then another element that changed things up in the 1700s was statistics. So math changed things. We like when math changed things in the English department. But basically what happened was that they started using like heterosexuality as like a product to sell to help with expansion and colonialism. So they started measuring like birth rates, death rates, like how many kids everyone was having. And this became very important. The individual needed to like start to take stock of like what they were doing sexually, and institutions started to become interested in this, which they hadn't been before. So of course there's much more surveillance and less agency. Yeah, so systematic campaigns tried to transform the sexual conduct of couples into a concerted economic and political behavior. So it picks up all this charge of what's going on. And then we go to children's sex. So this is an image from the movie version of The Turn of the Screw. So it just really reminded me of that, right? Like there's adults like peeking in through children's windows and surveilling them and wondering. There's kind of sexual tension. So children's sex becomes a big topic, and that also proliferates a lot of discourse, and it intensifies sexuality basically, and sexual discourse. So you have educators, physicians, administrators, parents. You have everyone talking about it. So kids are just enclosed in this web of discourses. They're just being penetrated by all these discourses. They're losing their privacy. I don't think he goes too much into why that is, but it's pretty wild and kind of creepy. So I'm not loving it. And then he goes into social control. So basically, not only were they looking at children and they were looking at the heterosexual relationship, but they're also just, they're looking at is sexuality is like dangerous. So then you really need to surveil it, right? Because the minute like, if you're like a concerned parent wondering if your child is in trouble or something, if they're doing something sexual, now you have a real problem here. Now we just have to double down and proliferate way more talk about sexuality to try to prevent it. We need to just stop it, right? But in the sense, by talking about it, you're not stopping it, and by fixating on it, you're actually adding sexual charge to it. So that doesn't work at all, and that's kind of what Foucault's argument against Freud would be. Is like Freud's like, oh, like you successfully repressed it. We're basically trying to pull it out, but Foucault is saying no, that's not what's happening. It's being intensified in like very specific ways and means for specific people. Okay, so he basically is saying that the two things that are causing, he's saying the objectification of sex in rational discourses and the idea that each individual was set to the task of recounting his own sexuality, it creates tensions, conflicts, efforts of adjustment, and attempts at retranscription. So I was interested in this idea because I was trying to figure out, to what end, right? So we're proliferating discourses, but why do we care, right? But so retranscription and adjustment, right? Now these to me are like power, like this matters because someone is being changed by these discourses. So you have to pay attention, right? Like what is it doing to proliferate all these discourses? Okay, so basically his overall trend is in the Middle Ages, you had flesh, a theme, the penance, like the mind versus the body. penance and confession was a discourse, but it was kind of the only one. Like the church was basically controlling the way that sexuality was expressed as a discourse. But after that, the uniformity is broken apart, scattered, multiplied. You have like an explosion of discursivities. And then you have a bunch. I love trying to follow all of the institutions he talks about because every time he slices them differently and he lists so many. It's so beautiful. But so this one, he says, demography, biology, medicine, psychiatry, psychology, ethics, pedagogy, and political criticism. So I kind of think of it as like the wheels, the spoke on a wheel spoke, right? So like if Christianity was the center, then basically now you have like all of these like institutional agents controlling sexuality, like spawning outward in time. So I guess this would be earlier, and then you'd be moving out in time to the end of the spoke. Okay, so we get this really weird, ironic thing going on where the secret of sex becomes telling sex. It's not about the sexual content itself, it's about the fact that you're talking about it is what becomes relevant. So he says this in kind of a complicated way, so maybe I'll just read it. We convince ourselves that we have never said enough about sex, that through inertia or submissiveness, we conceal from ourselves the blinding evidence that what is essential always eludes us. So we must always start out once again in search of it. But this is why there is a weird like lack of motivation here. Like, why do we want to keep reiterating talking about sexuality? Why do we need to refine it when it's already there? Like, what is? And he goes into that a little bit later. So he is really not impressed with Freud's idea that sex is outside of discourse and that you just need to like dredge it up from the unconscious, often the unconscious of a woman's body, of course, because women couldn't express desire, right? So you get hysterical women. So he's saying, no, it's a discourse. This is fine. And then he says, doesn't sex partake of the injunction by which discourse is provoked? Oh, I think I butchered that. Okay, let me think. Let me make sure. Okay, does it not partake of the injunction by which discourse is provoked? Is it not within the aim of inciting people to... Is it not within the aim of inciting people to speak of sex that it is made to mirror, at the outer limit of every actual discourse, something akin to secrecy whose discovery is imperative? So the next slide actually makes it a little better. When in reality, treating sex as a secret is a way of giving shape to the requirement to speak about the matter, a fable that is indispensable to the endless proliferating economy of the discourse on sex. What is peculiar to modern sciences, in fact, is not that they have consigned sex to a shadow existence, but that they dedicated themselves to speaking of it ad infinitum, while exploiting it as the secret. So again, in these three passages, I'm finding it a little hard to trace exactly like his, like the construction of the sentences, but basically like, we're making sexuality by, that's not really how to say it, but you can find the importance about sexuality in the discourses themselves, not the sexual content, in a sense. And talking about sex and talking about not talking about sex is actually very sexually charged in a sexual act. So it's very ironic. Okay. I love all this garrulous attention, which has us in a stew over sexuality. And then he's basically, this is chapter 2, so now he's kind of rephrasing his argument. Like, okay, is it just about population then? Is it just about labor capacity? Is sexuality just an economic issue? And then he says, I don't know. And I love that so much. he's fine with that. And I think that's so beautiful. I love that about Freud too. Freud says all the time, like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking about it. Okay, so this was a little bit more boring, so I just listed a couple of slides. So he started splicing up like who's controlling sexuality when it comes to like the heterosexual relationship. So let's see, he's got customary regularities, constraints of opinion. Oh yeah, canonical law, the Christian pastoral and civil law. So you've got church, you've got laws or the judicial system, and then you have the Christian pastoral, which is like the administration of church, so church and state, basically. And so they're determining matrimonial relations. So he basically talks about how they're really interested in determining matrimonial relations, but then he just says, and then they stopped. So it's not really a really exciting point in the essay, which is fine. So he says then there's a centrifugal movement with respect to heterosexual. So you're moving away. Anyway, you moved away. He said nothing further was demanded of heterosexual relationships studying it than to define itself from day to day. So the normal couple is now left alone. That's nice. They're not being surveilled. But now we get perversion. So basically anyone who is not that, right? Anyone who is other to the heteronormative relationship. And so he looks at the beginning, sodomy. And I really love his take on this, but it is actually kind of controversial because, anyway, from a queer theorist perspective, it's weirdly controversial. Maybe I'll mention that or maybe not. But he's basically saying sodomy was just an act. It didn't have an identity attached to it. But then what happens with this proliferation of discourses is now, like, he says, homosexuality becomes a species. So all of this weight and all of these meanings and all of these significations are now attached to it from these institutional controlling agents. So, yeah. But the queer, I guess one sentence is the queer theorist perspective is kind of interesting. So I have a class on queer sci-fi with Professor Pearson, and they were saying, like, actually political activism for queer people is, it talks about how, like, oh, queer people are the same as everyone else. It's just, they're just different in who they sleep with. But they were saying, like, that's kind of problematic, actually. So I'm still confused, but I think he has a hot take here, the way he's writing it, and I'm living for it. Like, I think it's very interesting. Yeah. Oh, and this is so beautiful. So he basically says that, yeah, homosexuality was constituted from the moment it was characterized. And then I always read it like that, and then I stop. But it's true, right? In that sense, too. It literally comes into existence when you make it, when you label it, when you frame it, right? And I think that's just such a beautiful... I'm not sure if the hyphen is supposed to do that, but every time I read it, it's like, yes, it comes into existence when you name it, right? Because you make a category, and then this is all it can be, right? But that's not necessarily at all accurate. And why would it be? Because it's the institutional agents are trying to make that happen, right? It's not based on, like, integrity in a sense. Yeah, and then he just talks about it can be, sexuality can be imbued with, like, masculine or feminine in a specific way. Again, this, I wasn't that interested, but it's probably important. So he's basically saying, so debauchery is now, like, okay, you had debauchery, it used to be important, now it's not important. Oh, I don't want to, whatever, there's, I can't even parse it right now. I think he has basically a point. Okay, let's try. Similarly, in the Civil Order, the confused category of debauchery, which for more than a century had been one of the most frequent reasons for administrative confinement, came apart. From the debris there appeared on the one hand infractions against legislation or morality pertaining to marriage and the family, and on the other offenses against the regularity of a natural function. Offenses which oh yeah. So the interesting thing about this point is, like, queerness is a problem of natural function, right? That's how it's being spliced, right? You have legislation on one hand, and morality, but now you can just say queer people are unnatural, and this is a huge problem. And then that's punished by law. From the end of the...
Like, one more minute.
Okay. Well, let's go to... Wow, I guess I just talked more than I thought it would. I'm so sorry. I did not think it would be long. Okay. Okay. It is said that no society has been more prudish. Never have the agencies of power taken such care to feign ignorance over the thing they prohibited, as if they were determined to have nothing to do with it. But in fact, the opposite has become apparent. Yeah, no, if I have 2 minutes left, let's not do that slide. That's not very helpful. This is the best slide then. The machinery of power that focused on this whole alien strain did not aim to suppress it, so the alien strain being perversion, but rather give it an analytical, visible, and permanent reality. It was implanted in bodies, slipped in beneath the modes of conduct, made into a principle of classification and intelligibility, established as a reason of being, not the exclusion of these aberrant sexualities, which people still think today, but he's reframing this as, like, these are like created on purpose by institutional agents for their agenda of having power, basically. So the human is kind of split into these pieces of a pie, and everyone like wants a piece of the pie in terms of sexuality. So I guess the question would be, can we apply this framework to gender? Which institutional actors benefit from intensifying discourses about transness and framing it as an ongoing question or debate? Like, who wants to keep talking about it, right? Like, who? Because that's the thing with these discourses. There's an idea where you have a motive to keep it an issue. You want to keep talking about it because then it benefits you, right? It gives you a platform, basically. And then tips for reading Foucault, then if I have another second, is like, Foucault likes to play the devil's advocate in extended passages, so you have to really pay attention to whether what he's saying is what he means, because you can just like fall into the lull of it and think, oh, he thinks this, and then you're like, oh no, that's not at all what he was saying. And then as you go through highlighting the institutional actors like economic system, political system, as he talks about them, really I think is helpful to see all the linkages. He's very into like the structure of power. Do I have like one more second, or was that it? Are you timing it?
I think you should stop. Yeah, that's good. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to turn this off.
Yeah.
I'm going to just sort of go back and forth with my other glasses. Okay. Very good. I mean, there's just a few things I will have us highlight here. Yes. I mean, the two main, well, let's say three main methodological features of Foucault's work. The first thing is just that there is a history of sexuality. That this isn't the timeless thing. Even in Freud, sexuality is almost like ahistorical. It's just always been there. Okay, since day one, since the becoming of the human, or something like that. The unconscious is ahistorical. It has no history. Obviously, different ways people sort of respond to their sexuality has changed over time. So it's not like he's ignoring all that, but he doesn't really historicize it. He doesn't tell you that it's changed from this era to this era to this era. So sexuality has a history. Pleasure, desire, these things all have history. They're not just sort of like automatic drives or anything like that, or implanted in you once and for all. And I'll just add that in our language, we might also say that he's close reading sexuality, close reading desire, close reading subcategories of that. Let's say homosexuality, heterosexuality, child sexuality, so on and so forth. Priestly attitudes towards sexuality, and so on. Okay, yeah, and just building on what Jen was saying, that there's this argument around what's called the repressive hypothesis, might have, associated with Freud and others, which is sort of like the idea that there was all this libertinism, like de Sade, or the poem To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, although that's supposed to be a mockery of the libertine. But anyways, that sexuality is sort of kind of largely unrestrained in the 18th century, and then sort of becomes progressively clamped down into the 19th century. That would be the repressive hypothesis, to the point where, well, certainly by the early 19th century, there's already sort of the institutionalization of it, the medicalization, the penalization, like turning it into law and law breaking. All sorts of things come to take some sort of control or containment, or sort of to give it a kind of, like, say, structure and social like organization. That happens. That happens probably much earlier, even. I mean, to be honest, you could date that probably from the history of sexuality. But as Foucault is very keen in transition from, let's say, 16th, 17th century to 18th, 19th century, this supposed repressive hypothesis, as Jen says, is not exactly about repression. It's about switching from one version of, let's say, organizing sexuality to another version of organizing sexuality. And this 19th century way of organizing sexuality, it does seem to line up with the explosion of capitalism, the explosion of making productive bodies efficient, let's say, utilitarian bodies that are sort of maximizing productivity and so on and so forth. And to that degree, things like the family unit, the heterosexual couple becomes the center of that sort of system. And at the same time produces all these peripheral, like who's not being productive, who's not being, this also produces, by the way, the norm. The heterosexual as the norm and the standard, or the center of sexuality as such. And of course the margins, the pervert or the homosexual or any number of sexual deviants become labeled as such. So it produces both center as well as periphery or margin, and so on. That's the repressive hypothesis. I'm going to reproducing or reiterating some of this math here that Jen did. And then the second is that incitement to discourse, he says. The phrase is just that actually everyone, as Jen has nicely said, discourse has been proliferating actually all along about sexuality. So the repressive hypothesis doesn't make sense. It's not like there was more talk and less talk. It's been talk all along, but it takes different shapes and becomes emphasized in different ways. Okay, that's good enough for that now. And I'm not going to go into the language, the theorizing of silence and so on. I think Jen did a great job. I just want to ask you, actually, let's take a slight step back and just understand, what does power mean for Foucault? This is at the same time that he's been working on decades or so of theorizing what power is. And he will very much tie power and subjectivity together. And I'm just going to ask us if we can understand that. I'm looking for some of my good quotes for this. I hope I labeled them, but okay, well, I'll start even at 1425 when he says, the very last sentence of 1424 and 1425. He says, Western man has been drawn for 3 centuries to the task of telling everything concerning his sex. Since the classical age, that's the 1600s, 1700s, there has been a constant optimization and an increasing valorization of the discourse on sex, and that this carefully analytical discourse was meant to yield multiple effects of displacement, intensification, reorientation, and modification of desire itself. Not only were the boundaries of what one could say about sex enlarged, and men compelled to hear it said, but more important, discourse was connected to sex by a complex organization with varying effects, by deployment that cannot be adequately explained by mere reference to a law of prohibition, right? So not about repression or prohibition or control per se, just only. A censorship of sex, he asks. There was installed rather an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex, capable of functioning and taking effect in its very economy. Just skipping a little, maybe. It says, not a collective curiosity or sensibility, right? Not a new mentality, but power mechanisms, and function in such a way that discourse on sex, for reasons that will have to be examined, became essential. Towards the beginning of the 18th century, there emerged political, and political can be another word for power, but it's not just politics. Economics includes power. And so, anyways, political, economic, and technical incitement to talk about sex. And if you think about many of Foucault's sort of typical rhetorical kind of languages, things like later on at the bottom of this, sex is going to be regulated. It's going to be administered. There's going to be procedures. It might be a police matter. There's going to be, he says at the very bottom, not the repression of disorder. I remember this is not a repressive hypothesis, but an ordered maximization of collective and individual forces. And so on. And I could go on and on and on, but that's just one page where you see a lot of this language. So my question is can we have a little articulation of what is his theory of power here? How does he mapping sexuality simultaneous with a sense of sort of what power means in this method? It's a tricky, big picture question about Foucault. And as I switch glasses back and forth,
I was kind of thinking of like sexuality as a resource of kind of like an intellect, like a intellectual property. It's not necessarily just an economic resource, but the way people talk about it and the power that different institutions get how they're allowed to own specific aspects of it, right?
Very good. Yes. So when we're talking about power, it's not just a question of like liberal Democrat or NDP versus liberal, whatever, like or right versus left or police or the state or whatever. It's already that there's all these different institutions, was the word you used, Jeremy, Foucault loves that word, that play a role in administering or let's say effectuating power with or on or over. There's a lot of variety there. Something like sex. And those institutions could be the church, they can be education. He doesn't spend a huge amount of time of like the school, but it shows up here and there. That's a big deal in Discipline and Punishment. If you ever read that text, it's sort of like a horror story about being at school. And you're like, no. All this. And by the way, think about how much discipline goes on in the school. Like, I'm testing you, and what's your grades, and who gets the awards, and who's the unruly student, and so on and so forth. And so, school is just a system for producing disciplinary effects. We might suggest, along with knowledge, hopefully. But anyways, so school, church, the law, so legal institutions, psychoanalysis, which is not any of the first three. It's its own new institution in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But prior to that, we might have said like biology or like natural sciences. They're producing power on sex. Or producing language on sex, they're empowering themselves through a sort of discursive saying, I know what sex is. Okay, and we could have added to this picture. The point is, okay, so far so good. We've elaborated a little bit about this theory of power, and you want to say a little bit more about what is Foucault's method when it comes to, say, power and sex. Sarah?
It kind of seems to me like it's got two elements, and one is like discursive. So it's like power is your ability to like define and discuss.
Good.
And then the other is like surveillance.
Uh-huh.
Power is your ability to look and like observe.
Yeah, to see it or to label it or to make it public or to incite it in other ways, like through confession or through through like when the law sees the sexual act that it considers not against the law, right? And so on. So to make visible. And we talked about the male gaze and scopophilia and cinema studies and sort of film theory, film form. Certainly caught up. A sort of surveillance gaze and a male gaze have parallel or connected histories. Okay, good. Anyone else want to add? Is this good? Yeah. Overall, this is it might say, oh, this is just about sexuality. It's not really about power. Well, Foucault's point is that they always come together, and maybe it has become a bit of a cliche or stereotype or just, I don't know, reductivism when theorizing Foucault, and Foucault is all about power. Like that's to me a very miserable take. But his point is that power has never disappeared, and it wasn't just in the political realm; it was in the everyday life realm, and in not just on the bodies, but also in the words or the discourse. So that there were effects of power or situations in which power was present all along throughout all of one's life. But I don't want to again reduce the word power to like force or violence or control. Power can be like who gets to say what when. Who gets to say that this word means this? Good desire. This word means bad desire, or your dreams mean this. And their wish fulfillment in a sort of unjudgmental way, or their wish fulfillment in a very judgy way. I don't know. There was sort of a power discourse continuum or continuation all along. Power discourse knowledge, we might say, if we're using all Foucault's terms. So again, if you would reduce all that to power, then you miss the whole picture. If we reduce it all to knowledge, we miss the whole picture. Finally, one last point, maybe just having read Foucault for 40 years would allow me to have a little bit of a bird's eye view, which is to say that Foucault wants to make the argument that power is very plural and dispersive and basically very network-based rather than top-down only or traditionally. But traditionally we theorize power as like there's people who have it and people who don't. There's the authorities and then there's the dispossessed. And it's just this very sort of, again, top-down or binary model of power. And then he also says, like, the example would be like the king, when we theorize power, the king has all the power and everyone else doesn't. And he says we need to overthrow the king when we're theorizing power. We need to cut off the head of the king and recognize that power is plural. And again, I don't want to say that it's omnipresent, although that's probably the right word for it, but it's present on a continual basis, whether or not there's a political figure or political act, that's clearly at stake or something like that. So again, just to the degree that we can use language, use style, take pleasure in literature or something like that would be a form of claiming discursive authority, which is intertwined deeply into the history of power over bodies. And to the degree that English department says we don't want power over bodies, but we want pleasure in discussing and reading and style, we want all that, then we are pushing back against the history of those who think, no, pleasure's got a certain role. Pleasure's not scientific, by the way. But yes, there's a science on it, because, look, we can measure stimulus. Psychology knows what pleasure is. Or pleasure's for the private, pleasure's for the home, pleasure's for Netflix. Pleasure is for, or style is for, it's not serious. Serious stuff is solar panels and voting and, factories and borders. Those are serious things. Style is frivolous and, indulgent or blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the whole point is I'm presenting you this map because who decided that the center was that and style or pleasure or bodies go over here or something like that? No, all of that is to be contested. And we can contest it when we have a better theory of power, and we can historicize and close read things like bodies, not pleasures, and so on. All right, that was the long speech about power. I think I'm going to just stop there. I know we're sort of time-wise got a lot to take on, and well, actually, sorry, one last thing. I always say that, which is just like the end of this text. So going to 1439, the question would be sort of like, well, what do we do now? Yes, Foucault, we've historicized, we've understood that it's a question of who's inciting discourse, who's labeling people, should we label people, can we get away from that? Should we liberate ourselves? Is that the right word for the next step? And the book has only a brief amount to talk about that, but he's somewhat skeptical of liberation psychoanalysis, like people like Herbert Marcuse, Wilhelm Reich, well, even Freud, but also the 60s and 70s sort of, even to some extent, feminism, which would say sort of free your body and then everything's changed. The rest will follow, as we say. What does he say about that? Take a look on 1439. I'll read here. It says, near the bottom, all right, about 12 lines from the bottom, it says, accompanying this encroachment of powers, scattered sexuality is rigidified, became stuck into an age, place, a type of practice. A proliferation of sexuality is through the extension of power. And this could be the 19th century, it could be the 20th century, it's up to you. An optimization of the power to which each of these local sexualities gave a surface of intervention. This concatenation, particularly since the 19th century, has been ensured and relayed by the countless economic interests which, with the help of medicine, psychiatry, prostitution, pornography, have tapped into both this analytical multiplication of pleasure and this optimization of the power that controls it. Pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another. They are linked together by complex mechanisms and devices of excitation and incitement. We must therefore abandon the hypothesis that modern industrial societies ushered in an age of increased sexual repression. skipping maybe the last sentence here. But it is the opposite that has become apparent, at least after a general review of the facts. Never has there existed more centers of power. Never more attention manifested and verbalized. Never more circular contacts and linkages. Never more sites where the intensity of pleasures and persistency of power catch hold, only to spread elsewhere. And he's talking about sort of the up to the present. So that includes the present. So I ask you, what would you say about the argument that we should orient our politics and our bodies towards something like sexual liberation? If we feel like all of this, this optimization, this power, this labeling, instrumentalization, and so on, has created all this, these sort of experiences of pain and force and so on over people, should the response be something like sexual liberation? I'll ask you what you think, having read as far as you have through your Foucault journey. Jen?
Well, does he think power is unescapable? Because that's kind of his whole point. Like, if it's literally always there, is it a utopian fantasy to think you can crawl out of that?
So liberation would not be liberation from power, therefore, to use that language, to sort of get away from power, is misleading because, as you said, you're right. Famously, power is always present, and therefore, the idea that there would be a sort of a powerless or beyond power or sort of post-power kind of fantasy is not going to happen. Famously, Eve Sedgwick called this a paranoid method, because if power is everywhere and it's always present and you can never escape it, it's the paranoid mentality towards power. And she thought her work would move from beyond that, but we're not there yet. We got 2 readings. Any other thoughts, final thoughts about Foucault and liberation, sexual liberation, if that's
can we say, like, even if we think, like, we can escape from one system of power, like, another system of power will just replace it, so we'll be caught in a cycle?
Yeah, I think that's well said, there's no capturing, to some extent, it would seem, one might be replacing one with another. And this is a big question for queer theory in particular, because they are devoted to some form of emancipatory project. And to the degree that they think that maybe Foucault is wrong about that. Maybe that's the impression he gives, that just we're doomed to switch from one form of power to another. It still is an open question, I'll just say. But for Foucault, it's maybe not an open question, because he agrees with that statement, that it'll just be another form of discursive incitement, labeling, and so on, where let's say, even homosexuality to become a sort of everyday kind of condition or something like that. And Foucault's right at the edge of queer theory and homosexuality as a movement, as a politic, as a form of embodiment, and so on. And he even himself has this. He's of course, homosexual. You know that. I'm sure it says it in the footnote there, in the headnote. And he has a very interesting relationship to his own closetedness or non-closetedness. But it would seem that he stops short of envisioning the next steps, we might say. Okay, let's leave him there. And see where Judith Butler takes this. So Butler is 20 or so years later, and kind of inventing queer theory as a method with this famous Gender Trouble book. I will read this opening few sentences here, 2377. Okay, so Butler says the following: categories of true sex, discrete gender, and specific sexuality have constituted the stable point of reference for a great deal of feminist theory in politics. These constructs of identity serve as the points of epistemic departure from which theory emerges and politics itself is shaped. In the case of feminism, politics is ostensibly shaped to express the interests and perspective of women. But is there a political shape to women, as it were, that precedes and prefigures the political elaboration of their interests and epistemic point of view? How is it that identity shaped? How is that identity shaped? Sorry. How is that identity shaped? And is it a political shaping that takes the very morphology and boundary of the sexed body as the ground, surface, or site of cultural inscription? What circumscribes that site as the female body? Is the body or the sex body the firm foundation on which gender and systems of compulsory sexuality operate? Or is the body itself shaped by political forces? The sex-gender distinction and the category of sex itself appear to presuppose a generalization of the body. And so on. There's a little more. I'm going to pull our display up again. So, I ask you, having just read what I read, where do we put the body? According to Judith Butler, according to feminism. According to feminism, it would seem we would put it here. I'm going to put a question mark though immediately. And by bodies we mean women and men, right? And men. Right? Physiological or corporeal distinction. So what is Judith Butler saying about this move, whether it's feminism or any other discourse per se, but what is she saying about that in those opening sentences and question marks? Judith Butler is no easy, her material is her sentences are very dense. So it's yet another brilliant theorist whose sentences require multiple readings to make sense of them, or lifetime of reading, which is a good thing. So Sarah, what is she saying about the body from the get-go here?
Basically that, like feminism, there's this body theory that presupposes that the physical human body and women's bodies in particular are kind of like objective facts. They're the base on which you can build your theory about what it is to be a woman and like the politics that surround it. And so what she's saying is, does that body actually exist prior to the idea of the politics that we put upon it, or does it exist because we have this idea of the politics, and that kind of also creates the body?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So essentially, let's go back and forth. It is a question, where do you put the body? And feminism thought it knew. We're going to put it in the category of sex or nature or anatomy or whatever. And then base the politics on that. And her question is how do you make that? How did you do that positioning? And what does that positioning entail when you put the body there? And what are the politics of that positioning? As well as sort of, I'm going to use the word epistemology, especially becomes important for Cedric as well. Sort of what sort of like thoughts about knowledge and language even and so on are implied in that. Okay, so far so good. Actually, I realized I slightly skipped a page. I usually like to read the first sentence of every reading. I jumped with my very bad eyesight. For some reason, I'm just having a bad eyesight day. And so let's kind of return to this just in a second. I wanted to read the 2375. And first get this word trouble on the as well on the map. So, this book is written in the late 80s, this Gender Trouble, and it was obviously in dialogue with some arguments around feminism in terms of understanding bodies and desires, and Butler is what would she call herself? Like, would she call herself a feminist? Well, she's trying to invent a new method, because she's not just a feminist. She's also queer, and to the extent that they are not exactly the same thing, feminism and queer, she's trying to articulate that. So, on the very first sentence, she says the following: contemporary feminist debates over the meanings of gender lead time and again to a certain sense of trouble, as if the indeterminacy of gender might eventually culminate in the failure of feminism. Perhaps trouble need not carry such a negative valence. To make trouble was, within the reigning discourse of my child, something one should never do precisely because one would get into trouble. She says slightly later, hence I concluded that trouble is inevitable, especially when you're a kid and you're always getting into trouble. And the task, how best to make it, what best way to be in it. And then she goes on, there was other ambiguities in the scene. And she talks about Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre. Both of whom started to sort of do a kind of critical reversal and say that self and other are certainly connected, but famously Simone de Beauvoir is like, woman is the other, man is the same or the self. And to the degree that one might be a feminist or have a feminist critique, one might want to reverse that or insist on a kind of dialectical kind of reversal, but sort of overthrowing of that hierarchy. Okay? And is that what Judith Butler means by trouble? What is she doing with it in these opening sentences, the one I just read? What does trouble mean to her? What does it mean to trouble, or to be in trouble, or to trouble something, and so on? Okay, go.
Well, it kind of feels like she's using it in the sense of like destabilizing, kind of a like normal or like consistent sense of what like gender or like being female is.
Okay, good. Yes, good. So feminism might be wanting to know exactly what a woman is. That's the whole point. When another theorist comes along and starts raising questions about it, destabilizing, as Samantha said, is that seen as the sort of, does that help or hurt feminism? Does that ruin feminism? And I should have put another word up here, which would be, is this where we put the word essence? And to the extent that the word trouble, and I think the word trouble applies to all of this, might it be changing the way, changing the stakes of what something like feminism is thinking of? So, okay, so far so good. Benson, you had your hand up as well. So anything you want to add? No, that's good. All right, so far so good. Okay, about trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of reminding me of like the uncanny a little bit. The idea of like
Good.
you don't know when one thing starts, another one begins.
Yeah. So uncanny. What's the line between life and death, or machine, or biology? What's the line between home and unhome? So on and so forth. So the uncanny is the troubling of these sort of supposed clear distinctions between inside, outside, and so on. And to the degree that Butler's using a bit of Freud or that psychoanalytic tradition, absolutely. Psychoanalysis, I also just think of, like, for example, that Adam Phillips reading. And there's a side of Freud that loves to label and stabilize and map, and then there's a side of Freud that loves to sort of complicate all that and to become uncanny on his own theory. And queer theory is going to say that instead of trying to maybe, like feminism, sort of decide and map and fix everything and say women is here, man is here, or even to overthrow it by saying actually we're all on some sort of sense of in the same position, it might be to, like the uncanny, start to think about what happens when we don't have that map. What happens when we're not sure where things stand. And there are questions of ambiguity or instability or non-placed, like questions about where to place something. And we stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway will say a little bit later. Okay, so far so good on trouble. Trouble becomes a word for critique as well. Trouble certainly becomes a word for queerness. To be queer is to sort of raise trouble, or to be troublesome, or to be a troubling thing in the system of supposedly orderly patriarchal values that we still see today. The queer becomes that thing that bothers the patriarchal system, or perhaps the capitalist system, or so on. Okay, let's see. So we got trouble, and then we got the body as two related things that sort of connect to each other in that Butler is not sure where to put the body. Okay? It could go in any three of these categories. Embodiment, bodily existence or bodily pleasure or bodily identifications. They could go in any of these categories. And so to that extent, to what extent are the categories themselves being troubled? Are the categories themselves being questioned and shown to be unstable and not particularly clear? Like, what is the sex-gender distinction? Is it a distinction anymore? It's not that Judith Butler is saying, let's not ever use these terms anymore, but she's certainly saying, we're not going to walk around saying sex is body and gender is the display of that body. Or the sort of the cultural attachments we have to the displaying of that body. So women wear pink, men wear blue. And it's just this little stupid, this kind of display factor. She would already want. I think the pronoun is still she. I'm not sure. Maybe Judith Butler uses they. It's they pronoun. Okay. So they would prefer that the none of these, like all these categories are going to be troubled. Okay. And let's see, I'm looking for some good examples of that. So Butler, just a couple of notes as we get to some examples. On 2381, there's a long discussion of someone named Mary Douglas. Not that important, but Douglas is at least pointing out that if you're talking about the body, where does the body begin and where does it end? So the body is on 2381. We get this point that it's always sort of monitoring the inside and outside or the permeability of the body, but it's always doing that because the body is constantly. So 2381, second paragraph says the construction of stable bodily contours relies upon fixed sites of corporeal permeability and impermeability. Those sexual practices in both homosexual and heterosexual contexts that open surfaces and orifices to erotic signification or close down others technically reinscribe the boundaries of the body along new cultural lines. So I didn't fully set that up, but anyways, the point is even bodies are full of variations on permeability. And who decides which is the permeable site and which isn't is already an interesting question. So where are we to put body and sex? It already is a question of which parts of the body are being emphasized as essential or sexual, according to whom, and so on. So again, on 2382, the boundary of the body as well as the distinction between internal and external is established through the ejection and transvaluation of something originally part of identity and the defiling of otherness. So not to belabor this page at all either, but there's some psychoanalysis going on here. So in psychoanalysis, it's always about what do you take in and what do you leave, what do you push out, what do you interject and what do you refuse? Where do you put the boundary on what you sort of let in and either force out or push out? And to the degree that psychoanalysis doesn't really know, it's a variable thing based on people's psychoanalytic histories. Butler is saying, look, whether it's the physical body, whether it's the psyche, the psychoanalytic, I wouldn't call it exactly a body, but the psyche itself, these are permeable things. These are variable and permeable things that if you want to be Foucault about it, you could say that of histories, but if you just want to be describing them, they have all sorts of blending of inside and outside. You even remember like Paul Deman made this point, Derrida made this point, where is the inside of something? Where is the outside of something? It all depends on which part you're picking. And to the degree that you can never really decide, ultimately, because it's indecidable, as Derrida would say, that you are caught up in sort of the constant decision making. You might also say surveillance, you might also say choice, you might also say variety, whatever. And so Butler set this up and said, well, hold on, none of these discourses are stable. They are all, from the get-go, trouble. Just like Tim said, like of psychoanalysis itself is trouble. And there is no inside-outside sort of stability in psychoanalysis. So to the degree that is the case, and we could have said in language, it's the same story, if we were using deconstruction, then why should we assume that this will be stable, that bodies will be stable, and so on? So finally, at the bottom of 382, regardless of the compelling metaphors of the spatial distinctions of inner and outer, they remain linguistic terms that facilitate and articulate a set of fantasies, feared and desired. Inner and outer makes sense only with reference to a mediating boundary that strives for stability. And this stability, this coherence, is determined in large part by cultural orders that sanction the subject and compel its differentiation from the adject. So, was culture all along doing the work of making maps? Sort of. This is to some extent the degree that maybe Butler is going to overemphasize the cultural over against any other fact of this map. You'll see Sedgwick push back a little bit on that. But this is sort of early Butler. Early Butler was sort of like, everything might be cultural. And then the next word we're going to say is, might everything mean, because everything's cultural, is it performative? Is that what we mean by culture? My goodness, time is flying, so I'm not doing a good job here. But so let's look at that word performative on 2384, and then quick sense of what she means by that, and probably as far as we'll get. And so Butler says, starting with this middle page on 2384, according to the understanding of identification as an active fantasy or incorporation, however, it's clear that coherence is desired, wished for, idealized, and that this idealization is an effect of corporeal signification. In other words, acts, gestures, desire produce the effect. This is where I put them here in sexuality. Produce the effect of an internal core or substance, but produce this on the surface of the body. Where? So these get. This is very Foucauldian language, but these get put on the body, and the body gets put into where? These are this, something like that. Effect of an internal core substance, but produces on the surface of the body through the play of signifying absences that suggest but never reveal the organizing principle of identity as a cause. Such acts, gestures, and enactments generally construed are performative in the sense that the essence or identity that they otherwise purport to express are fabrications, manufactured and sustained through corporeal signs and other discursive means. That the generative body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from its various acts which constitute reality. I think that's enough, just since I'm going fast here. What the heck does she mean, do they mean, apologize, by the word performative here? A famous Butler word. What does it mean by performative? You even want to take it Nilu and then
So I want to connect it, to explain it, I want to connect it to law and how code use law. So we might think that, so the law would be telling us that there is an essence inside of us that is defining us in some specific way, that is defining an identity for us. But it's actually it's like there is no essence. It is the practice of, even everyday practices. It is what we, how we perform the things that were dictated to us that give us that illusion that there must be some essence from which these practices are coming from. So performativity and those actions are what will lead to this illusion that there is an essence.
okay, good. I'm gonna just put I almost want to put the word performance here under this. Okay, as we saw, Butler had listed all these. Okay, and then the next question is where do you put these? Are these displays of gender or are they essences? That, like, manifestation of a certain essence. So Butler, we know, doesn't think that this is true anymore. Why? Well, who decided which was inside and outside the essence? Who drew the line? Okay, we've already deconstructed that. We got that. We rejected that linguistically. We rejected it even physiologically. We rejected it even culturally. Like, who decides what is the sort of center and periphery of any of those terms? Then might we all put all of this as cultural things? I put even performative here too. Might we put all of these as just displays of gender performance? Well, yes, actually. This is what Judith Butler is arguing. That all of this goes here. And that, in some sense, this was never this even collapses into here. Okay, so this goes into here, this goes into here, this is the only thing left. Butler has since, by the way, revised some of this argument and said, to be honest, the whole thing, this performativity is a bigger category that should really encompass the whole thing. And instead of collapsing everything into this, the next book that Butler writes, by the way, is called Bodies That Matter. So it's sort of trying to say, wait a second, hold on. What was my theory of the body? What was my theory of even like materiality? Not starting to adjust it and saying, wait a second, maybe I don't collapse everything into culture. But even since then, Butler has been sort of revising and trying to come up with a better model that doesn't just call everything performative. But it's interesting that, again, Foucault gets very cliched, and so do not walk out of this class and say, Foucault's all about power, and Butler's all about performativity. No. And even Butler continues to treble performativity, as I put them nicely together there. And performativity means what? That's the question. Not that everything is performative. It means what? The next section of the text goes into drag. It's a famous example of performance. Performance isn't exactly the same as performativity. By the way, I put the word performance here, specifically because of that. And drag is a performance. It is a theatrical demonstration in which, as we say, it's a double inversion. This is 2385. It says appearance is illusion. And so in some sense, it doesn't even matter what's the inside. Well, the inside-outside distinction is constantly sort of getting played with, we might say, in drag. Drag says, my outside is feminine, but my essence inside is masculine, but all these are in quotes. At the same time, it symbolizes the opposite. My appearance outside, so people might identify one's physical or appearance characteristics as masculine, but my essence inside is feminine. So it's the constant sort of moving or shifting around of those two. It's not like they've disappeared, like there's no such thing as masculine, there's no such thing as feminine. It's that these can be moved around based on the performative circumstances and identifications that one is having. That's what gender performance means. Just to read a little bit more here. Okay, so drag would seem to be a parody of sexual identification and sexual style, but that's partly the point. Parody is not necessarily negative, that have been said to be maybe by feminists as well as by patriarchy. Later on, Butler says, we are actually in the presence of three contingent dimensions of significant corporeality. Anatomical sex, there's sex again. Gender identity, there's gender. Third is gender performance. So I had put performance there, but again, I really think this whole map is what we would call performative. If the anatomy of the performer is already distinct from the gender of the performer, and both of these are distinct from the gender of the performance, then performance suggests a dissonance not only between sex and performance, but sex and gender performance. So you can really permutate these all over the place. Right? These can play this can perform this. This can perform this. This can perform this. You do whatever you want. Perform whatever you want. It's all sort of intertwining in this map. That's what gender performity means. And you can call it parody. You can call it anti-essentialist or post-foundationalist, because there is no essence of what manness means, what womanness means, what queerness means. There is no essence to really any of these. And those who would say that there are those who don't understand that what performative is, and that they like masculinity also includes performativity, femininity also includes performativity. It's not just queerness, but the whole map. Everyone was doing forms of gender performance, and it's just that sort of the queer theorists or drag were acknowledging performance as performance. Everyone else was saying, no, I identify with X or Y. And it's not a performance. But we'll see, interestingly, Cedric, take that on. Okay, just one last thing or two here. It is just that Butler also calls this a style. So that's an important word for us. You should always flag that word. It's a literary word, we'll say. So maybe we have pluralities of bodies, pluralities of performance, pluralities of identification. To the degree that we have pluralities of being, we might call that stylistics or styles of being. We might call that, on 2386, we might call that practices of resignification, recontextualization. Some of that language is taken from Derrida. And just 2388, finishing here, it says gender ought not to be, top of 2388, gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts follow. Rather, gender is identity tenuously constituted in time, instituted in exterior space through a stylized repetition of acts. There was a longer argument that I don't cover here, which is using Derrida, which Derrida always says all language requires repetition. You can repeat the words I'm saying. Anyone can recite. Built into language is repetition and recitation and reiteration. But to that degree, it's always being read or reread, and it's always potentially being resignified. So again, pharmacon. To the degree that everyone keeps citing it and reciting it over and again, it changes meaning and it is recitable. It was never stable to begin with. That's the point. All words work that way. And if that's the case, then all words are caught up in style. Style is the practice of reading, rereading, resignifying, reinterpreting, and so on and so forth. And so even language or meaning show that we are stuck with style. There's no non-stylized body. There's no non-stylized existence or non-stylized language, non-interpreted language, and so on. By the way, even behind all that is someone like Nietzsche. Gotta get my Nietzsche in on a weekly basis. And so behind style is nothing. This is an old, again, Nietzschean or even Derridian, there's no essence behind it. It's just, so reading Butler, the very bottom, 2388. If gender attributes and acts the various ways in which a body shows or produces its cultural signification are performative, then there is no pre-existing identity. There's nothing behind the performative by which an act or attribute might be measured. It's not like saying, sex was the real truth of all of this. None of this was the real truth. Then there is no pre-existing identity by which an act or attribute might be measured. There would be no true or false, real or distorted acts of gender. And the postulation of a true gender identity would be revealed as a regulatory fiction. That gender reality is created through sustained social performances means that the very notions of an essential sex and a true or abiding masculinity or femininity are also constituted as part of the strategy that conceals gender's performative character. Okay. I hope that is a good Butler review, and we'll take a break. 10-ish minutes break, 5:18.
I couldn't tell if it was bad or good at any point. Oh, I'm glad. Thanks. I was actually gonna ask you if it was how.
Really good.
Okay, thanks.
You remember how you ever had Dr. Joseph?
Oh, well,
Yeah. Oh, I love him. He was one of the other. So Professor Keep and Nigel Joseph were the two professors who wrote letters for me to get into the master's program. Yeah, I love them. Aw. Well, that's a really good compliment.
Yeah.
Thank you. He's so cool.
Yeah. I really, when she was like master's, kind of felt like
early humans were like,
Oh, that's like fun. Thank you.
kind of progressively socialized.
Yeah.
We're in here.
Make signification. Do you want me to put my slide?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Jen, you